welcome to another episode of my podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. I am your hostess, Caitlin, with 20 plus years experience in sewing and 12 plus years experience within living history, and this podcast explores my adventures within living history, how I incorporate the 19th and 18th and 20th centuries into my everyday 21st century life, historic wardrobes, clothing, anything basically of women's health and all the fun women-y things of earlier time periods. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, I would love it if you consider following along by subscribing so that you're notified anytime I upload a new episode. So last time we discussed looking poor in the mid-19th century, and this week we're going to dive into my adventures of trying to find my place within 1940s or World War II living history, and again, struggling to find my place there because it's been a struggle. So without further ado, let's get started. If it's one thing I cannot stand, it's not having a job or something by which to occupy myself. I cannot be trusted with nothing to do. In the 19th century, this is no problem. I find that in the 19th century and earlier, living historians are not wanting for things to educate the public. And the more I think about it, I do believe that this is because there is a novelty in doing everyday things in the 19th century, and again, even earlier, because the methods and even the clothing are strange to the public and therefore worth watching. And I find that isn't necessarily the case the closer you move to modern life. For instance, cooking in the 19th century and again earlier is a novelty for most modern people. The vast majority of the general public does not cook on an outdoor fire, indoor hearths, or wood-burning stoves. These things are novelties and they capture people's attention. Compare this to a 1940s gas stove. The stoves and ovens don't look very different from the modern day, and they don't work much different either. And I know plenty of people still have and use vintage stoves every single day of their cooking, and so there is no novelty there. I myself have a reproduction 1940s stove that works just like an original one does. It's porcelain and I cook on it every single day. There's no novelty there. Grocery stores were around by the 1940s, so how people got their food was often not changed, and the only real new thing for a visitor would be the recipes used. But in the 19th century, I have not only the unusual recipes, but also unusual cooking styles and method. This means while it takes 1 minute to answer the question, what are you making, and explaining the recipes and where I got them, I can further keep the public's attention in the 19th century with the method of cooking. It's hard to maintain that with 20th century cooking. Sure, there will always be those people who are truly interested and will stick around, but I find there's less of a carrot, so to speak, to keep that public interested as we get closer to the modern times. Unless, of course, they lived through those times and are then just want to reminisce with me and watching me, and they want to relive their childhood and remember how their own mother cooked for them, dressed the same way I'm dressed, cooking on the same stove that I'm cooking on. Which I love talking to those folks about that sort of thing, because it's a very niche group of people that is interested in sticking around and talking to me through that. And of course I can keep on talking, especially through World War II, with ration stamps and how I get food and how much is allotted per person depending on the year, how I supplement with garden food, etc. But there's still that spark of novelty missing, especially for children, or at least I perceive it that way. And the same thing with sewing. Sewing machines don't work much differently in the 1940s than they do today. Things could be electrified. Houses look so similar to modern houses. I even live in a circa 1940s or 1950s house today. Even if the novelty was there, I find the vast majority of the World War II era events are heavily military focused, which is fine. There are many women's roles there. WWII, or Women's Army Corps, there were women in the Navy in addition to both the Army Nurse Corps and the Navy Nurse Corps. But I am not a nurse, nor do I play one, and I am not about that military life. I don't have the personality for that, nor am I interested in that line of interpretation. So because I don't find 20th century home life engaging for the public, or at least I don't find that my methods of interpreting 20th century home life are engaging to the general public, and because I don't do military, that drastically reduces my options for interpretation. Most often I find female World War II reenactors, if they are not doing liberty and do not have a house to play in, are regulated into one of two groups. The first group is the pretty picture prop and the victory garden trope. And there's nothing wrong with either one. I personally find that I need more of a purpose than just being a pretty picture prop for visitors. But there are people who really enjoy doing that, and they can talk about the clothes and the fashions while doing so. And that's all fine and good. And then there's the victory gardens, which are a great way to bring kids into participating with you. And I think victory gardens are a great way to interpret to the public. My preference, however, is to teach something that visitors would not be as familiar with, and gardening is something that even if a child lives in an urban area is still learning in school. And part of this, I think, is because I taught first grade for 8 years. And we always had an 8 or 9 week unit on plants and science, and gardening was part of that. And we would garden every single year. And maybe that's where my true aversion comes from, is being too similar to what I did for a living. And so it's not fun for me because I do this all the time anyway. And so maybe that's, again, where my aversion to being regulated to a victory garden lies. And again, a lot of these military events don't even have an area for a victory garden. So what are you to do then? And so all that to say that I've had a very hard time finding my place within World War II living history. My husband loves doing World War II, and thankfully for me, the first couple of years that we've known each other, all of the World War II events he's gone to were campaigner type events, which meant I didn't get to go. And that gave me time to go to events in other time periods or stay home and get things done. But always in the back of my brain, I knew I'd have to get an impression together sooner or later. And that is not to say I've never done World War II myself. Back when I was in college and worked in a museum, I had a personal goal of making an outfit for each temporary exhibit that the museum put in for the last year or two that I worked there. I already had my 1860s clothes, but we put together a traveling exhibit that covered the 1920s through the 1950s, and so I made an outfit for each decade. It was more of a dress up and be a pretty picture prop for the exhibit's opening, so I wasn't concerned about having a job or doing anything other than promoting the exhibit. For my first 1940s outfit, we had 2 American Red Cross gray lady dresses, or rather hospital and recreation as they are formerly known, and so I copied them to the best of my ability at the time. I don't even think I used a pattern or traced the originals because I think they were honestly both too big for me at the time, and I couldn't find a pattern, so I drafted it myself, and honestly it turned out really well. I don't know how I managed that actually, because I don't feel like my drafting skills back then were anywhere near where I should have been able to accomplish that, but I did. And I'm kind of impressed still that I managed to do that. I am about 85% sure I did trace the cap on my own to make my own, like I traced the original to make my own. I bought some patches from online, and again, it turned out. I did buy the incorrect arm patch. I bought the American Red Cross Volunteer patch, which is an 1850s patch. The correct wartime patch would be American Red Cross Service down on the bottom. And so, yeah, I did buy the wrong one. I also bought I did buy the 1946 Hospital and Recreation pin, and not the wartime one that I should have purchased. And I still had actually bought the correct one of that, actually. I do have correct service patches now, but I haven't bought the correct pin. And that was my single World War II outfit for the next 12, 13 years or so. Basically until this year when my husband has decided he wanted to get me out at more World War II events. And I had to face the fact that I needed to find myself a place. Although there was not a hospital for me to play at for this impression, I did want to start with recreating my original attempt, as although I could technically still fit into it, the arms were a bit tight, and there's a big gaping hole right at the bust, which is where I've grown the most, to the point to where it's not appropriate for public wear, let's say. So this time I bought the correct surface patch and replaced the volunteer patch, and I finished the interior seams as I should have done in the first uniform. By 1942, the service veils have been replaced by caps. But in case I did any earlier war stuff, I also did, and because I'm just a sucker for veils, I did make a veil so I could interchange that part. I could do an early, just pre-war or early war hospital recreation impression, and I could do a later or mid-war one as well. So I can technically interchange them now. And I also made long sleeves and short sleeves. I have the short sleeves attached to the outfit right now, and then I have the long sleeves in case I ever went to a cold weather event and I wanted them. They're very easy to put in. There's no gathering or anything into the arm's eye. It's just very smooth fitting. It's just a quick, simple seam to take out and a quick, simple seam to put them back in. And I find that it personally wastes less storage space if I only have one outfit per uniform instead of 2. And it makes it cheaper as well, because it's a lot easier to buy an extra yard of fabric for 2 sleeves than it is to buy an extra 4 yards for a whole new dress. So now I had a World War outfit to wear, but I still did not solve the problem of giving me a place and a job to do. Thanks to Shirley Powers' American Red Cross memorabilia website, I know that there were other corps other than just the hospital and recreation, which again is where I started. And the hospital recreation service corps were the women who worked in hospitals, but they did no medical work. So they were more morale boosters to the soldiers, and they did tasks such as running errands or reading to them or writing letters for the soldiers. If I had a hospital setting in which to work, I think it'd be a fantastic impression. A lot of older people remember the Gray Ladies, and it's actually a very romanticized impression that I would actually get a lot of interest in, because people would remember that, and they would remember the Grey Ladies before they remembered the nurses or the nurses' aides. And so I think it's a great impression to pull in, especially the older crowd of people coming to events. But again, I had no hospital setting to do that in. So that is when I went down the rabbit hole of Red Cross Service Corps and how to incorporate them into an impression. So my first big step was going to be a big event in Ohio, and I was going to spend time with a lovely lady that my husband Rhett introduced me to, and she did Production Corps, which is the corps that did sewing. They sewed on patches, worked on uniforms for soldiers, made little bags for soldiers to carry things in, etc. All of these people who did any of the corps were all volunteers who provided their own uniforms, which were set out in guidelines by the American Red Cross, but sometimes they varied slightly by the chapter that the individual was a part of and what fabrics they had in their area. So the indoor uniform for most service is just a 6-piece gored princess seam dress with long or short sleeves and either a coif or a veil, although those were again discontinued in the early war. But each corps had a different color that made it easy to distinguish the corps from one another. For instance, the Production Corps used a white uniform with dark blue epaulets and cuffs. Hospital recreation uniforms were a medium gray with white epaulets and cuffs. Now, I did not end up going to the Ohio event because I had begun a new job and we couldn't find anyone to watch all the animals for us at home because we live on a farm and we have critters running around that need care. And so I ended up staying behind, which was unfortunate to a point because I was very much looking forward to sitting and learning from the Production Corps ladies there. But real life always has to come first, especially when there are living beings involved that need care. And so yes, real life always comes before hobby life, even if hobby life is more fun. I did not get to my Production Corps uniform, although I did get to cut it out before we realized I wasn't going to be able to go. So that still actually needs to be completed. But it was just about a week after the Ohio event was over that I went ahead and made up my hospital recreation gown to reproduce the dress I made prior. So at this point, I've basically decided that because the uniforms are so easy to put together, I've decided to do one for nearly every corps. I will not do Motor Corps because I've learned through World War I reenacting that I don't actually care for Motor Corps. It is far too close to military for me to enjoy it whatsoever. And honestly, I need my own car for that, which down the road maybe, but as of right now, we don't have. Actually, we do have a car that would technically work. We have a 1929 Model A that would still technically be in use for the 1940s. And so yes, I could drive Flossie around, but getting Flossie to events can be somewhat difficult because it takes us so much longer to get places in her, and if we're traveling for many hours to get to events, sometimes it takes us a whole extra day off work or whatever to take her down as well. So that doesn't always get to happen. So I found that even with Motor Corps, I didn't necessarily get to have my place. And also, again, it's too close to military for my liking. I don't care for it. And also, I don't read Braille, so I can't do Braille Corps. And also, that corps was disbanded in 1942 anyway. I also won't do Arts and Skills Corps for right now because that started in 1944. It's on my eventual list of things to do, possibly, but I'm going to do the corps that I can do. I'm going to do the corps, basically, except for Motor Corps, all the corps that were there when the beginning of the war started and were there when the war ended. That's my main goal right now, again, except for Motor Corps, because of the reasons I mentioned above. So, of course, I have already made my hospital and recreation uniform, and my Production Corps uniform is cut out. After that, I'm going to make a nurse's aide uniform for post-1941, which is when the uniform changed from light pink to blue. Although eventually I do want to make the pink version as well for just pre-war. The nurse's aide uniform was different than all the other corps uniforms. So it'll be fun difference in patterns before going back to the other corps. And then I think next I'll make epaulets and cuffs, coifs, and veils of turkey red that can be worn on the Production Corps dress instead of the blue, and that would turn it to Administration Corps. And I can also make them in purple for Home Service Corps and yellow for Roll Call, which was not really a real corps, but someone who called roll call at chapter meetings, but they wanted uniforms, and so the Red Cross came up with uniforms for them. So they were allowed to wear a white uniform with the yellow accents, only when providing the roll call services for meetings and also for parades. Also, the purple one for home service, they were not allowed to wear their uniforms for actually doing home services, which is the ladies who would go to houses and work with soldiers' families about how to get benefits, help with communication between the military and the families at home. They were doing that sort of thing. They would wear their pin, but they were wearing their regular everyday outfits. they were only allowed to wear their service uniform for parades. But since those epaulets and cuffs could be made detachable, they could also be sewn in, but they could be made detachable. I'm going to make mine detachable so I can have that one white uniform and just interchange all the colored accessories to get the different service corps, which will help me save a lot of time and space. Most of it is just going to be for display purposes because I don't see myself doing administration, home service, or roll call as a living history demonstration. But because it's only costing me like $3 in fabric, which are basically just fat quarters, I figured why not. And after making the extra accessories to do those particular corps, I think we'll go on to canteen service, which I already have experience with doing World War I living history. Canteens are more or less the restaurants for soldiers, and those women wore uniforms in medium blue. And that's an easy one for, I think, site volunteers who serve meals to other reenactors or maybe hand out waters. The canteen service would be a really great uniform for people. So I feel like having a canteen service uniform would be useful for living history in case I got pulled to do more background work at an event. And I also think if you have some cooking skills but no house to work in, a canteen service would make a great option for a living historian who just needed a job, so to speak. And I will also make the yellow uniform for staff aide. And finally, I want to also make a home nursing uniform, which again was not a corps, but I have an original home nursing, I guess it's an instruction book. And so I feel like having the uniform to go along with that book would be fun. And if I remember correctly, their uniforms look very much like the nurses' aide uniforms. They wore more of a blue-green color. So my purpose in having all of these uniforms is really just because they are so quick and simple to make up, and they only take a few yards of material. And they take such little storage room that I see no harm in having just about every corps, so I can easily adapt my impression to an event without having to worry about whether I can fit my skills into interpreting the public. Another reason I have honed in on the service corps for World War II reenacting is honestly because it makes a fantastic impression for people of just about any skill who just don't want to do military or just strictly civilian for whatever reason. It makes it a great place to start. So women with a variety of skills can easily fit their skills within a core impression. If you can sew, cook, serve food, drive antique cars, write letters, or read, if you have basic medical knowledge, or at least have the willingness to learn basic World War II era medical knowledge, you can fit each one of those skills within a service corps. Now today, the American Red Cross is mostly regulated to things like blood drives, at least in people's minds today. They do other things, but that's in what people's minds. The organization back in the first half of the 20th century carried out a vast quantity of support for the war effort. According to an official Modern American Cross publication, quote, World War II and the American Red Cross, by 1945, there were 7.5 million American Red Cross volunteers serving alongside 39,000 paid staff members that all worked together to provide service for the military. In terms of military and naval support, the American Red Cross can also be broken down into three categories: camp, club, or home. Camp service consisted of field directors and assistant field directors assigned to and often living with the armed forces with the intent to assist in ways such as giving advice or support to individual servicemen and women, providing communication between servicemen and their families at home, assisting in financial needs and emergencies, and distributing supplies and comfort items. Club service was created in the behest of the U.S. government to assist with servicemen who were overseas by way of providing service clubs in which servicemen would receive overnight accommodations, hot meals, recreational activities, laundries, barbers, rest homes, and beginning in 1942, clubmobiles, which took these services on the road by means of half-ton trucks or single-deck buses to serve donuts, coffee, newspapers, gum, etc. to servicemen and women in England, France, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. And finally, home service, which supported the family members of servicemen by means of consultation and guidance, communication between families of servicemen, information and help with benefits and pensions, financial assistance through grants or loans, etc. Like we already talked about the home service a little bit. The home service also met emergency and supplemental needs at domestic Army and Navy installations and served in veteran hospitals. Members were organized into chapters based on where they were located, and within each chapter they were organized into the volunteer service corps based on their skills and ability and desire to support the war effort and those at home. So this makes it easy to interpret as a civilian, so with no medical knowledge, but still able to support the military. So I like to call it civilian with a purpose. And now comes the part of the podcast where I'm just going to regale you with why a service corps impression is really a great option if you're struggling to find your place within World War II reenacting or even World War I, because most of these service corps were around then as well. You can fit a service corps impression to virtually any living history scenario. Do you own a period car or have access to one? Motor Corps is for you. Can you sew by hand, or perhaps you have a period sewing machine or access to a period sewing machine? Try production corps. Do you enjoy cooking and trying period recipes, or do you perhaps have a role in feeding the military living historians? Why not go with a friend or two in blue Service Corps uniforms and go as canteen service? Does your event have a hospital or a place to interpret a hospital setting? You can interpret a nurse or a nurse's aide or a hospital and recreation corps, depending on how much medical knowledge you have and want to present. Do you know Braille? You can do a Braille corps impression. Do you have secretarial skills or administration skills and a place to interpret? You can try out administration corps or staff assistance corps to interpret a little known and little shown corps to further the public's knowledge and also other living historians' knowledge. Are you someone with experience with certain craft or even a profession that you can demonstrate and teach within a hospital setting? Try Arts and Skills Corps. You can fit a service corps impression into virtually any living history scenario. At a museum, giving a talk about how women supported the war effort. Because most of the service uniforms are of the same pattern but in different colors, it's easy to run up a few and discuss how these women in uniform use their skills to support those fighting for freedom. At a weekend or a day event, set up a tent or an area with some uniformed women to sew as production corps members, or make lunch for other living historians, although I would check about local food laws with food vendors. Sometimes even if you're not charging, there are still laws. So check about that. Or if there's a hospital at the event, check with the event organizers about doing an impression that fits that setting. Are you at a fully immersion civilian event? Why not have several corps represented in civilian leisure time and perhaps even interpret a chapter meeting? There are so many different ways to bring a corps impression to an event or museum to enrich the experiences of not only the general public, but also the other living historians. The one downside, I think, to interpreting the service corps within World War II is that these interpretations are often best done with at least a few other members in the same corps, as service corps usually worked as a group to ensure a better outcome. It's difficult to be the only uniformed production corps service member at an event, when usually in those uniform settings there were a group of women working together to perform those tasks. It's nearly impossible to run a canteen by yourself with a single worker, and it's important to have several people to accurately interpret the canteen worker's experience. And all this means is that it is time for you to drag some friends along with you to get out of that pretty picture prop trope and to do a fun and useful task to educate the public about civilian lives and roles while we're there. So for clarity's sake, I am going to touch briefly on each corps as well as the colors that they wore for your convenience. I know we kind of talked about it earlier, but just a little bit more concisely, we will mention it here. The Administration Corps provided administration support and direction to the programs of the other corps. They wore the indoor uniform in white with turkey red soldier tabs, cuffs, and the coif or veil. The Staff Assistance Corps provided office and administration support in chapters, hospitals, and other Red Cross sites. They wore the indoor uniform in canary yellow with white shoulder tabs, cuffs, and coif and veil. Hospital and Recreation Corps women were found in hospitals, again doing non-medical work such as running errands, writing letters or reading, and tutoring. They did no medical work and had no medical training and were strictly regulated to morale building activities. They wore the indoor uniform in light gray with white shoulder tabs, cuffs, and coif and veil. The Canteen Service Corps served snacks and meals at docks, airports, rail stations, military posts, and at blood donor centers, child care centers, and schools, mostly within the United States. They wore the indoor uniform in medium blue with white shoulder tabs, cuffs, coif, and veil. They often also wore aprons, which there was no official pattern for the aprons. I've seen several different styles, but I have read from Red Cross sources that the chapter should all have the same style of apron. So whatever y'all choose as a group, it just needs to be that apron for y'all. You can choose really any period pattern of apron you choose to do. I've seen some very interesting shaped ones, but usually they're just a very plain little apron. Always in white though. I've only seen them in white. The Production Corps was by far the largest volunteer service corps, and they made or repaired 64 million pieces of clothing and prepared over 2.5 billion surgical dressings, and they assembled also over 30 million comfort kits and other articles for the U.S. military. They wore the indoor uniform in white with dark blue shoulder tabs, cuffs, and coif and veil. The Motor Corps transported the sick and wounded, delivered supplies, and took volunteers and nurses to and from their posts. These women drove their own car and completed training in auto mechanics in order to be able to make automotive repair should the need arise. Their indoor uniform consisted of the regular indoor uniform in light green with white shoulder tabs, cuffs, and coif and veil. I've actually never seen an indoor uniform for a motor corps, and I have looked. So I'm not entirely sure they really existed, because that's not what these women were typically wearing. They had other uniforms. They had a summer uniform and a winter uniform that looked a lot more militaristic in style for whenever they were on duty. The Rail Corps began in the 1920s, but was discontinued in 1942 due to technological advances that rendered the skill less essential. So members of the Braille Corps transcribed literature for use by the blind. They wore the indoor uniform in dark blue with white shoulder tabs, cuffs, and coif and veil. The Arts and Skills Corps in 1944 gave war-injured patients the opportunity to do creative and constructive work under artists and craftsmen to learn new skills for their post-war lives. At their peak, the Arts and Skills Corps had over 6,000 volunteers in the 1945 to 46 time period within 105 American hospitals. They wore the indoor uniform in a blue-gray seersucker fabric. The Home Service Corps helped the families of military personnel. They also helped service personnel by sending messages to their families, with over 42 million messages being sent during the war. They only wore the uniform again for parades and pageants, and it was the regular indoor uniform in white with purple shoulder tabs, cuffs, and coif and veil. Aside from the Corps, the other uniformed members would include the roll call people, which we already discussed, who wore their indoor uniform in white with canary yellow shoulder tabs, epaulets, and coif and veil, and also the Red Cross paid staff, who wore a gray-blue uniform with gray-blue shoulder tabs and cuffs, but no veil or coif. So I also want to touch briefly on the indoor uniforms and how I made mine. There are several original patterns from companies such as McCall's, Simplicity, and they are very hard to come by. I have been looking and I have been unable to find one. Thankfully, I've had the opportunity to look at a couple of original garments up close and in person, and also they are for sale everywhere online. So I found it very easy to see the construction details on the originals through online listings. The fun part is that there's no standard in how these were made, because although some of them were made professionally and you would just buy the uniform, a lot of them were made at home and therefore just had a lot of variety in the skill and the techniques used. So for myself, I had not the mental capacity to draft my own pattern this time around, although I did for the first time. So I wanted to try an experiment. Wearing History on Etsy has a 1940s nurse's uniform that at first glance looked right, so I bought it. Turns out it's a separate bodice and skirt that are then stitched together with an attached waistband, so that's not a separate belt. And after looking at the Wearing History pattern, I began thinking, could I just tape the skirt pattern pieces to the bodice pieces, draw lines on the bodice pieces, because the bodice was actually only in two pieces. There was a front and a back. And I was like, can I just draw lines and then cut them and add seam allowances and make my own Service Corps uniform? Turns out, yes, I absolutely could, and it works remarkably well. One day I will add a video on exactly what I did and explain all of that, but essentially I used an original 1947 nurse's uniform and modified it to make a different style, because I did not change any style lines and only the pattern lines. It still retains all its original 1940s lines. The results are fairly spot on, and I did not have to do any super, mathy draft work. So now the pattern does not include a cap or coif pattern, much less a veil pattern. And although Wearing History does have a nurse's hat pattern, it looks more similar to later 1940s service hats, not the wartime ones. And I've yet to find a period pattern for those. So next time I have the opportunity to study an original, I will trace the hat and provide that pattern for people. For anyone else who wants to start doing this as an interpretation, I would trace mine now and give you the pattern, but I'm only 85% sure I took that from the original, so it could be very off. And yes, eventually I will start doing World War I Corps and doing all the researching and patterning for that, but I have a lot more research and things to do with the World War II time period before I start that. My current project is looking through all the original Red Cross publications and pulling those resources to learn as much as I can. Some of the corps had courses that the volunteers had to take and pass before they could take on the corps and wear the uniform and do the work. So I'm finding all the resource manuals for that. So basically I'm in the pre-impression research phase, getting my background knowledge to the point where I can portray these women accurately. All the more not as glamorous parts of reenacting, it's a lot of reading. Thank goodness for Google Books and Internet Archives and HathiTrust and good old Amazon and thrift books for hard copies where I cannot find them online. And for all the things that aren't a research priority for me at this moment, are getting saved for later research, such as like the Junior Red Cross and the college units, which I do eventually want to look into further, but just is not currently a priority. And while I'm in the book phase of research, I am also, of course, recruiting others because, as stated before, it's hard to do this on your own. Fortunately, I know Texas women who want to get more into 1940s, and I think I convinced a few of them to come and join me on this adventure. We're going to start with production corps because a lot of us have sewing experience, and then we'll probably work on canteen corps if we can get enough people. And that will just about wrap this up, this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. Thank you so much for listening to my current research into beginning to do more World War II interpretation as a woman who does not enjoy the basic civilian life and does not enjoy military life at all. I had a lot of fun researching for this, and I look forward to doing more. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me or find me on Instagram or YouTube under the name Caitlin Kearns. I hope you enjoyed this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. If you did, please leave a review on Spotify or on YouTube and share this episode with your friends. Also, please don't hesitate to let me know if there's any topics you think I should cover in the future. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next video.